Ethan Maxwell stood in the glow of the Seattle skyline, his reflection a ghost in the glass of his study window. At 30, he had achieved more than most people could in a lifetime. His startup, a groundbreaking AI company, had launched him into unimaginable wealth. The mansion he called home was an architectural masterpiece, complete with marble floors, a state-of-the-art garage filled with luxury cars, and a personal staff to cater to his every need. Yet, none of it filled the gnawing emptiness that had taken root in his chest. It wasn't always this way. His mother, Claire Maxwell, had been his anchor, a woman whose warmth could fill any void. But her passing 5 years ago had left Ethan adrift. As the years passed, he buried himself in work, trying to drown out the silence that echoed through the mansion. Tonight was no different. The rain tapped against the window like a familiar tune. His phone buzzed, a reminder to visit his mother's grave. He hesitated, his chest tightening. Instead, he grabbed his coat and left the mansion, opting for a solitary walk. Ethan's walk led him out of his gated community and into a small park in a modest part of the city. The air was damp, carrying the faint scent of pine and asphalt. As he meandered along the path, his eyes caught a figure hunched over on a park bench. An elderly woman sat beneath a flickering street lamp, her hands moving swiftly over a tattered sketchpad. Her clothes were patched and mismatched, her gray hair tucked under a faded scarf. Yet, despite her worn appearance, there was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself. Ethan slowed, watching her for a moment, before curiosity got the better of him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft, not wanting to startle her. "What are you drawing?" The woman looked up, her piercing blue eyes meeting his. There was something familiar about her gaze, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. She hesitated before answering. "Just sketches. Keeps my hands busy." Ethan gestured toward the pad. "May I?" Reluctantly, she handed it over. As he flipped through the pages, his breath caught. The sketches were remarkable. Landscapes brimming with life, portraits that seemed to hold secrets in their eyes, abstract pieces that stirred emotion with their raw beauty. "These are incredible," Ethan said, handing the pad back. "You're not just a hobbyist, are you?" The woman chuckled dryly. "Once upon a time, maybe. Now, I'm just Harriet Brown, the old lady who lives on this bench." Her words were casual, but Ethan sensed the weight behind them. Without thinking, he blurted out, "I have a garage apartment. It's not much, but it's warm, and it's yours if you want it." Harriet narrowed her eyes, suspicion flickering across her face. "Why would you offer something like that to a stranger? What's the catch?" "No catch," Ethan replied, his tone earnest. I know what it's like to feel alone." The vulnerability in his voice seemed to reach her. Harriet studied him for what felt like an eternity before nodding slowly. "All right, at least for now." Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. As they walked back to his mansion, Harriet's cart of belongings creaking beside them, neither of them could have predicted the journey they were about to embark on. A journey that would uncover old wounds, buried secrets, and redefine the meaning of family. As they approached the towering gates of Ethan's estate, Harriet glanced at the mansion, her eyes widening in awe. "You live here?" "For now," Ethan replied, his tone distant. Little did they know that Harriet's arrival would spark a chain of events that would challenge everything Ethan thought he knew about himself, and everything Harriet had tried to leave behind. The early morning sun filtered through the grand windows of Ethan Maxwell's mansion, casting long golden streaks across the pristine marble floors. The stillness of the house, usually a comfort to Ethan, now felt charged with a new kind of tension. Down the hall, the faint sounds of conversation and movement signaled the arrival of his unexpected guests. In the modest garage apartment, Harriet Brown stood with her arms crossed, her weathered eyes surveying the space. The walls were plain but freshly painted, the furniture functional but comfortable. It was far more than she was accustomed to, yet the sterile perfection of the place made her feel out of place. "Mom, stop pacing," Lucy whispered, her tone sharp but tinged with worry. At 16, Lucy had mastered the art of masking her fear with a brashness that often put her at odds with her mother. "We're lucky to be here. Don't make him regret it." Harriet turned to her daughter, her expression softening. "It's not about gratitude, Lucy. It's about trust. No one does something like this without wanting something in return." Lucy sighed, running a hand through her tangled brown hair. "Maybe he's just a decent guy. Not everyone's out to get us." In the main kitchen, Mrs. Goodwin, the Maxwell family's longtime housekeeper, glanced toward the garage apartment through the large bay window. Her lips were pressed into a thin line as she returned her attention to preparing Ethan's breakfast. Two strangers, one of them a teenage girl, moving into the garage, she muttered under her breath. What is Mr. Maxwell thinking? Her assistant, Anna, looked up from slicing fruit. He's trying to help, Mrs. Goodwin. Isn't that what people with money are supposed to do? Mrs. Goodwin sniffed. Helping is one thing. Letting strangers into your home is another. I just hope he knows what he's doing. Ethan walked into the kitchen then, his presence as understated as ever, despite his wealth. Good morning, Mrs. Goodwin, he said, his tone warm but distracted. Good morning, Mr. Maxwell, she replied, handing him a cup of coffee. Your new guests, will they be joining you for breakfast? Ethan shook his head. They're settling in. Let them take their time. Mrs. Goodwin hesitated. If I may, sir, it's kind of you to help them. But are you sure it's wise? Ethan took a sip of his coffee, his gaze distant. They have nowhere else to go. I'd rather they be here than on the streets. Later that morning, Ethan knocked lightly on the door of the garage apartment. Harriet opened it, her posture stiff. Just wanted to check in, Ethan said, glancing past her at Lucy, who was curled up on the couch with a book. Is everything all right? Harriet hesitated. The apartment is more than we're used to. Thank you, good, Ethan replied, nodding. If you need anything, we won't. Harriet interrupted quickly, her tone firm. We don't want to impose. Ethan studied her for a moment. There was a guardedness in her eyes, a wall she had carefully constructed. You're not imposing, he said softly. This place has been empty for years. It's about time someone used it. Harriet didn't respond, but something in her stance relaxed ever so slightly. Before Ethan could say more, Lucy spoke up from the couch. Thanks for letting us stay, Mr. Maxwell. Call me Ethan, he replied, smiling. That evening, Ethan invited Harriet and Lucy to join him for dinner in the main house. Harriet reluctantly agreed, though she insisted on cooking, as a way to repay the gesture. Mrs. Goodwin supervised from the side, her eyes narrowing slightly as Harriet moved about the kitchen with practiced ease. As they sat down to eat, the conversation was polite, but strained. Ethan noticed the way Harriet's hands trembled slightly when she reached for her glass, the way Lucy's eyes darted around the grand dining room as though expecting trouble. What brought you to Seattle? Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Harriet hesitated, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. We move around a lot. Easier that way. Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't press. And the sketches? How long have you been drawing? Most of my life, Harriet replied, her voice softening. It's something that helps me think. Mom used to be really good, Lucy interjected, her tone a mix of pride and defiance. She even sold some of her stuff back in the day. Lucy, Harriet warned, her tone sharp. Ethan caught the tension, but decided to redirect. Sounds like you've got a lot of talent. I'd love to see more of your work. Harriet's expression closed off again. I don't draw for show. As the days passed, Harriet began to relax, if only slightly. She spent her mornings sketching in the garden, while Lucy explored the sprawling estate. Ethan found himself drawn to Harriet's work, often stopping to watch as she brought life to the blank pages with each stroke of her pencil. One afternoon, as Ethan admired a particularly detailed sketch of the garden, he noticed a name scrawled faintly in the corner. Richard Caldwell. Who's Caldwell? Ethan asked, pointing to the name. Harriet's hand froze, her eyes darkening. No one important, she said quickly, but the tension in her voice betrayed her. Lucy, who had been nearby, stiffened. Mom, maybe we should. Not now, Lucy. Harriet cut her off, her tone sharp. Ethan frowned but decided to let it go. For now. That night, Ethan stood by his study window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that Harriet was hiding something big. Down in the garage apartment, Harriet sat at her small desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Beside her lay a crumpled envelope with no return address, its contents weighing heavily on her mind. As she tore the envelope in half and tossed it into the trash, her face was etched with a mix of fear and resolve. Whatever secrets she was carrying, it was clear they weren't going to stay buried for long. The sun rose over the Maxwell estate, casting a warm golden hue across the sprawling grounds. In the garage apartment, Harriet Brown sat at her modest desk, her hands working deftly over a blank sheet of paper. Each stroke of her pencil brought the page to life, transforming it into a vivid scene of a bustling city street. A memory from a life she had long since left behind. Lucy watched her from the couch, her arms crossed. Mom, you shouldn't be drawing stuff like that. Harriet paused, her hand hovering over the paper. Like what? Stuff that makes you think about back then, Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. What if someone recognizes it? What if— Enough, Lucy, Harriet snapped, though her voice was tinged with weariness. We've talked about this. Let me have this. Lucy looked away, her jaw tightening. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. Later that day, Ethan found himself wandering toward the garage apartment. He hadn't intended to intrude, but something about Harriet's quiet determination had piqued his curiosity. When he knocked on the door, it opened slightly, revealing Harriet bent over her sketch pad. Harriet? Ethan called gently. Harriet looked up, startled. Ethan, I didn't hear you knock. Sorry, he said, stepping inside. I didn't mean to barge in. I was just curious. Ethan's eyes fell on the sketch she had been working on. The level of detail was astonishing. The cobblestone streets, the faint blur of people in motion, the play of light and shadow. This is incredible, he breathed. You're really talented. Harriet hesitated, then shrugged. It's just something I do to pass the time. No, Ethan said firmly, shaking his head. This is more than that. You could have a gallery showing with work like this. Harriet flinched at the suggestion, her fingers tightening around her pencil. I'm not interested in that kind of attention. Ethan studied her, sensing there was more to her reluctance than simple modesty. Why not? You've got a gift, Harriet. People should see it. It's complicated, she replied, her voice edged with a bitterness that surprised him. Let's leave it at that. That evening, as Ethan mulled over his conversation with Harriet, an idea began to take shape. The garage apartment, while functional, was hardly conducive to artistic inspiration. What if he transformed the space into a proper studio for her? The next morning, Ethan called in a team of contractors. Within days, the garage was unrecognizable. Bright lights were installed to mimic natural sunlight. The walls were painted a soothing shade of blue, and large windows were added to let in the actual sunlight. Easels, canvases, and an array of high-quality art supplies filled the room. When Ethan finally brought Harriet and Lucy to see the new space, Harriet stopped in her tracks. Her hand flew to her mouth as her eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "what have you done?" "I wanted to give you a real space to work," he said, smiling. "You deserve it." Lucy crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "Why do you care so much about us? What's in it for you?" Ethan looked at her, his tone earnest. "Sometimes, helping someone else helps you too." Harriet turned to Ethan, her eyes glistening. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll use it," Ethan replied. "That's all I want." As Harriet began to explore the studio, Lucy pulled Ethan aside. "You don't know us," she said, her voice low. "You don't know what you're getting into." "I know enough," Ethan replied. "And I know you both need a place to feel safe." Lucy's expression hardened. "Safe? You think we're safe just because we're here? You don't understand how people like us live." "Then, help me understand," Ethan said softly. "I want to help." Lucy opened her mouth to reply, but stopped herself. Shaking her head, she walked away, leaving Ethan to wonder just how deep their scars ran. Over the following weeks, Harriet began to settle into her new studio. Her hands, once hesitant, moved with newfound confidence as she worked on a series of pieces. Ethan often stopped by to watch her, captivated by the way she brought her memories to life. One afternoon, as she worked on a striking portrait of a woman with piercing green eyes, Ethan noticed a faint signature in the corner. "H. Brown." "Is this someone you know?" Ethan asked, gesturing to the painting. Harriet hesitated, her hand stilling over the canvas. "It's someone I used to know." "An old friend?" he pressed gently. "No," she said, her voice quiet. "It's me, or who I used to be." Ethan studied the painting, struck by the intensity of the emotion captured in the woman's eyes. "You were an artist," he said, more a statement than a question. Harriet nodded. "Once, a long time ago." "What happened?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It doesn't matter." But Ethan knew it did. One evening, as Ethan passed by the studio, he noticed the lights still on. Concerned, he stepped inside and found Harriet sitting at her desk, staring at a blank canvas. "Everything all right?" he asked. Harriet looked up, her expression weary. Sometimes the past has a way of creeping in when you least expect it. Before Ethan could respond, Lucy burst into the room, a letter clutched in her hand. "Mom," she said, her voice shaking. "It's him." Harriet's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" Lucy held out the letter, her hands trembling. "It's from Caldwell. He knows where we are." The room fell silent, the weight of Lucy's words hanging heavy in the air. Ethan looked from mother to daughter, realizing that whatever they were running from had just caught up to them. The morning dew clung to the blades of grass in the Maxwell Estate's expansive garden, reflecting the first rays of sunlight. Harriet Brown sat on a weathered bench near the rose bushes, her gaze fixed on the sketchbook resting in her lap. But today, the page remained blank. Her hands trembled slightly, the letter Lucy had brought the night before still fresh in her mind. Ethan Maxwell watched her from a distance, standing on the balcony of his study. Over the past few weeks, he had seen Harriet slowly open up through her art, but last night's discovery had clearly shaken her. He made his way downstairs and out into the garden, determined to find out more. "Harriet," Ethan said gently as he approached, careful not to startle her. "Do you want to talk about it?" Harriet looked up, her eyes shadowed with unease. For a long moment she didn't speak, her fingers gripping the edges of her sketchbook tightly. Finally she sighed and handed him the letter. Ethan unfolded the crumpled paper, his brow furrowing, as he read the hastily scrawled words. "You can't run forever. I know where you are. It's time we talked." "Caldwell?" Ethan's jaw tightened as he looked back at Harriet. "Who is Caldwell?" Harriet hesitated, her fingers trembling. "He's someone I thought I'd left behind," she said softly. "But he has a way of showing up when you least expect it." Lucy appeared then, her face pale but her eyes defiant. "We should leave," she said firmly. "He always finds us, and it's not safe here anymore." "No," Ethan said, his tone resolute. "You're not running anymore. Not from him." Lucy scoffed. "You don't get it. People like Caldwell don't just go away. He'll ruin everything." "Then tell me who he is," Ethan urged. "Let me help." Harriet and Lucy exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Harriet nodded. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you." As they walked through the garden, Harriet began to speak, her voice tinged with a mix of regret and resolve. "Richard Caldwell was a name you couldn't escape in the art world," she began. "He was a dealer, but not the kind you'd want to work with. He had power, connections, and a talent for finding artists who were desperate enough to sign away their work for a fraction of its worth." Ethan listened intently, his hands shoved into his pockets. "And you were one of those artists?" Harriet nodded. "I was young, naive, and eager to make a name for myself. Caldwell promised me the world. A solo exhibition, international recognition, everything I'd ever dreamed of. But it came at a cost." Her voice wavered as she continued. "He took my work, sold it under his name, and pocketed the profits. When I confronted him, he laughed, told me I'd signed away my rights, that no one would believe me if I tried to fight him." Ethan clenched his fists. "That's despicable." "It gets worse," Harriet said, her voice barely audible. "When I threatened to expose him, he found ways to hurt me. My reputation was ruined. Galleries blacklisted me. And when I finally escaped him, he made sure I had nothing left." Lucy interjected then, her tone sharp. "And then I came along, and he used me against her." Ethan's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Harriet's face crumpled. "Lucy's father was one of Caldwell's associates. When I found out about his connection to Caldwell, I tried to leave, but by then, I was already pregnant. Caldwell used my daughter as leverage, threatening to take her away if I ever spoke out against him." The weight of Harriet's story settled heavily between them. Ethan felt a surge of anger on her behalf, but more than that, he felt a deep sense of connection. "I'm so sorry, Harriet," he said softly. "No one should have to go through that." Harriet looked at him, her eyes glistening. "I don't want your pity, Ethan. I just want to keep my daughter safe." "I understand," he said, "but you shouldn't have to do it alone." For the first time, Harriet's expression softened. "Thank you," she said. "You remind me of someone." "Who?" Ethan asked. "I'm my husband," Harriet replied. "Before he got involved with Caldwell, he was kind like you. He believed in helping people." Ethan returned to the house that afternoon, his mind racing. He couldn't stand the thought of Harriet and Lucy living in fear. and he was determined to find a way to protect them. He reached out to an old college friend, Natalie Brooks, a lawyer who specialized in intellectual property and fraud cases. "Ethan, it's been ages," Natalie said when she answered his call. "What's this about?" "I need your help," Ethan said. "There's someone who's been hurt by a man named Richard Caldwell. I think he's still active, and I want to stop him." Natalie's tone grew serious. "Caldwell? I've heard the name. He's notorious in certain circles. If you're going after him, you'd better be prepared for a fight." "I am," Ethan said firmly. "Can you meet me tomorrow? I'll explain everything." That evening, Harriet sat in her new studio, her sketchbook open to a blank page. She stared at it for a long time before picking up her pencil. Slowly, she began to draw. The lines took shape, forming the image of a man with cold, calculating eyes, a face she thought she'd never have to see again. Downstairs, Ethan paced his study, his phone buzzing with messages from Natalie. He glanced out the window toward the garage apartment, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what the next steps would bring, but one thing was certain: Richard Caldwell wasn't going to win this time. The Maxwell estate buzzed with activity early the next morning, as contractors and delivery trucks filed through the gates. Ethan Maxwell stood in the driveway, clipboard in hand, directing the chaos with an unusual sense of purpose. The transformation of Harriet's garage apartment into a fully equipped art studio was well underway. Harriet and Lucy watched from a distance, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Mom," Lucy whispered, "he's doing too much. This isn't normal." Harriet frowned but didn't reply. Deep down, she shared her daughter's unease, but there was also a part of her that longed to trust Ethan's intentions. She clutched her sketchbook tighter, as if it could shield her from the vulnerability she felt. By mid-afternoon, Ethan appeared at the garage door, a broad smile on his face. "Come on," he said, motioning for them to follow. "I want to show you something." Harriet hesitated, but Lucy nudged her forward. Let's get this over with," she muttered. The garage was unrecognizable. Bright, natural light flooded the room through large windows that had replaced the old, grimy ones. Easels of varying sizes stood in neat rows, and shelves lined the walls, stocked with paints, brushes, and sketch pads. In the corner, a comfortable seating area invited moments of reflection. Harriet's breath caught in her throat. She stepped inside, her fingers grazing the polished wooden work tables. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling, "this is too much." "It's exactly what you deserve," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "I want you to have a space where you can focus on your art without any distractions." Lucy folded her arms, her gaze suspicious. "Why are you doing this? What's in it for you?" Ethan met her eyes, his tone calm but firm. "Sometimes helping someone else gives your own life meaning. That's all there is to it." Harriet looked between them, her heart heavy with the weight of her past and the hope she dared not feel. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes glistening. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to," Ethan said. "Just create." Over the next few days, Harriet slowly acclimated to her new studio. At first, she worked hesitantly, as if afraid the space might be taken away. But as her confidence grew, so did her output. Paintings of vivid landscapes and poignant portraits began to line the walls, each one a window into a life she had long kept hidden. Ethan often stopped by to watch her work, careful not to intrude. One afternoon, as Harriet added the finishing touches to a painting, he couldn't help but comment. "It's incredible how you bring these scenes to life," he said. Harriet glanced at him, a faint smile on her lips. Art was my way of telling stories when I couldn't find the words. And now? Ethan asked. Now, Harriet said, pausing. It's a way of reclaiming what was stolen. While Harriet found solace in her art, Mrs. Goodwin, Ethan's longtime housekeeper, grew increasingly skeptical. One evening, as she prepared dinner in the main house, she confronted Ethan. Mr. Maxwell, she began, her tone measured but firm. I've been meaning to talk to you about your new guests. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What about them? I don't mean to intrude, Mrs. Goodwin said, but are you sure you know what you're doing? These women, they have secrets. Secrets can be dangerous. Ethan leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. Everyone has secrets, Mrs. Goodwin. That doesn't make them dangerous. Mrs. Goodwin hesitated, then sighed. I just don't want to see you get hurt. I appreciate your concern, Ethan said, his voice softening. But I think helping them is worth the risk. As Harriet grew more comfortable in her new studio, one painting began to stand out among the others. It was a large canvas depicting a serene garden at twilight, the colors rich and vibrant. But there was a shadowy figure in the corner, almost hidden, that gave the piece an unsettling edge. Ethan noticed it one evening, as Harriet worked on the finishing touches. That one feels different, he said, pointing to the painting. Harriet glanced at it, her expression unreadable. It's a memory, she said after a long pause, from a time when everything seemed perfect, before it all fell apart. Ethan wanted to press her for details, but decided against it. Instead, he nodded. It's powerful. You should be proud. One night, as the estate lay silent, Harriet sat alone in her studio, staring at the garden painting. Her mind wandered to Caldwell and the letter that had shattered her fragile sense of security. She hadn't told Ethan or Lucy, but she'd received another note that day, slipped under the studio door. You think you can hide behind him? Think again. See, Harriet's hands trembled as she read the note again. The shadow she thought she had left behind was closer than ever, and the thought of what Caldwell might do next kept her awake long into the night. The next morning, Harriet found herself in the garden, trying to shake off the dread that clung to her. Ethan joined her, sensing her unease. Are you all right? He asked, his voice laced with concern. Harriet hesitated, then nodded. Just thinking about everything? Before Ethan could respond, Lucy ran out of the house, holding a newspaper. Mom, she shouted, her voice panicked. You need to see this. Harriet took the paper, her eyes scanning the headline. Former artist Harriet Brown, rumored to be in Seattle. Caldwell's associates investigate. Her heart sank as she realized the full weight of what was coming. Caldwell wasn't just threatening her. He was closing in. The sun dipped below the Seattle skyline, casting long shadows over the Maxwell estate. Harriet Brown sat in her studio, staring at the newspaper headline Lucy had shown her earlier that day. Her hands trembled as she traced the bold black letters that brought her past screaming into her present. Caldwell knew. He had always known. Ethan Maxwell stood at the doorway, hesitant to disturb her. Harriet, he said gently, breaking the heavy silence, we need to talk. She turned to face him, her eyes weary but resolute. I know, she replied, her voice quiet. It's time. Ethan sat across from Harriet, in the studio's small sitting area, his hands clasped in front of him. I've been thinking about how to handle this, he began. You need a way to reclaim your voice, to show the world who you really are. Harriet frowned, uncertain where this was heading. Ethan, I'm not sure. I found something, he interrupted, pulling a flyer from his pocket. It was an announcement for a prestigious art competition in Seattle. the same one he had mentioned weeks ago. This is your chance. Harriet stared at the flyer, her expression unreadable. Lucy, who had joined them, folded her arms across her chest. No, she said sharply. It's too dangerous. If Caldwell sees her work, he already knows where we are, Ethan countered. Hiding won't change that. But this could give you the platform to fight back. Harriet shook her head, her voice trembling. Ethan, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't. Caldwell will destroy me. He's already tried, Ethan said firmly, and yet here you are. Harriet, you're stronger than you think. Lucy's anger boiled over. You don't get it, do you? She snapped at Ethan. This isn't just about some art competition. Caldwell isn't the kind of man you can just ignore. He'll ruin her, us. Ethan turned to Lucy, his tone calm but resolute. I understand your fear, Lucy, but running won't protect you. This is about taking back your power. Harriet placed a hand on Lucy's arm, her touch gentle but firm. Lucy, she said softly, Ethan's right. I've spent too long letting Caldwell dictate my life. Maybe it's time to stop. Lucy stared at her mother, disbelief written across her face. You can't be serious. I am, Harriet said, her voice steady. I'm tired of hiding. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Ethan worked tirelessly to prepare Harriet for the competition, hiring a professional photographer to capture her best pieces and enlisting a publicist to help craft her story. Harriet was overwhelmed by the attention, but found solace in her art. She spent long hours in the studio, pouring her emotions onto the canvas. Each stroke of her brush felt like a step toward reclaiming her identity. One evening, as Harriet worked on her final submission piece, Ethan joined her in the studio. He watched in silence for a while before speaking. Do you know why I'm so invested in this? He asked. Harriet paused, looking up at him. Why? Because I see my mother in you, he admitted. She was an artist too. She gave up everything for her family, but she never stopped creating, even when no one else believed in her. You remind me of her. Harriet's eyes softened. Thank you, Ethan, she said. That means more than you know. A week later, an envelope arrived in the mail, bearing the seal of the art competition. Harriet's hands shook as she opened it, Ethan and Lucy watching anxiously. Inside was an official letter inviting her to participate in the finalist exhibition. It's happening, Harriet whispered, her voice a mixture of excitement and fear. Ethan grinned. This is it, Harriet. Your moment. Lucy, however, remained wary. If Caldwell knows about this, we'll be ready, Ethan assured her. I promise. Across town, in a luxurious penthouse overlooking the city, Richard Caldwell sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. The newspaper on his desk featured an article about the competition, complete with a list of the finalists. Harriet Brown's name stood out like a beacon. Well, well, Caldwell murmured, a sly smile playing on his lips. Looks like the prodigal artist has returned. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. It's time, he said. Make the arrangements. I want to see her face when she realizes she's out of her league. As the exhibition date approached, the atmosphere at the Maxwell estate grew tense. Harriet was consumed by her work, determined to make an impression at the event. Lucy, however, remained on edge, her distrust of Ethan's plan evident in every interaction. You're putting her in danger, Lucy said one evening, cornering Ethan in the kitchen. Do you even realize what you've done? I've given her a chance to fight back, Ethan replied calmly. And I'll protect her, no matter what. Lucy shook her head. You don't know Caldwell. He'll do whatever it takes to win. Then we'll be ready, Ethan said. But hiding isn't the answer. The night before the exhibition, Harriet put the finishing touches on her final piece, a hauntingly beautiful portrait of a young woman standing in a garden surrounded by shadows. It was a reflection of her own journey, a blend of light and darkness. As she stepped back to admire her work, Ethan entered the studio. "It's stunning," he said. "You're going to blow them away." Harriet smiled, a mix of gratitude and nervous anticipation. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." "Tomorrow," he said, "is the start of something new. For all of us." That night, as the house lay silent, a figure moved through the shadows outside the estate. In the morning, Harriet found a note taped to the studio door. "You can paint all you want, Harriet, but you'll never escape your past." See, Harriet's hands trembled as she read the words. She knew the exhibition was no longer just about art. It was a battle for her freedom, her future, and her family. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Harriet's studio, illuminating the vibrant canvases that lined the walls. Despite the serene setting, the tension in the air was palpable. Harriet Brown sat at her work table, staring at the cryptic note left on her door the night before. Ethan Maxwell entered the studio, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Any word from Lucy?" he asked, placing one of the mugs near Harriet. Harriet shook her head. "She left early to clear her mind. This whole thing has her on edge." Ethan pulled up a stool and leaned forward. "And you? How are you holding up?" Harriet's fingers grazed the note on the table. "I knew this would happen. Caldwell isn't the type to let things go quietly." "Which is why we can't back down," Ethan said firmly. "This exhibition is your chance to take control of the narrative." Harriet met his gaze, searching for reassurance. "And if it all goes wrong?" Ethan offered a small smile. "Then we'll face it together." Meanwhile, Lucy wandered the streets of Seattle, her mind racing with doubt and fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan's optimism was misplaced. Caldwell was ruthless, and she had seen firsthand what he was capable of. Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her phone. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. "You've been warned. Keep your mother away from the exhibition." Lucy's heart raced as she stared at the message. It was a direct threat, unmistakable in its intent. She considered calling Ethan, but hesitated. Instead, she turned toward the nearest coffee shop, needing a moment to gather her thoughts. Back at the estate, Harriet worked tirelessly on the final preparations for the exhibition. Each painting she packed felt like a piece of her soul being laid bare for judgment. Despite her nerves, there was a flicker of determination in her eyes. Ethan returned to the studio later that afternoon, his phone in hand. "I've arranged for extra security at the venue," he said. "Caldwell won't be able to pull anything without someone noticing." Harriet nodded, though her hands trembled as she wrapped the last canvas. "Thank you, Ethan. I don't think I could do this without you." "You're not alone in this," he assured her. "And you never will be." As the day wore on, Lucy finally returned, her expression guarded. Harriet noticed the tension in her daughter's posture. "Lucy, what's wrong?" Lucy hesitated, then held out her phone. "I got a message from him." Harriet's face paled as she read the text. "He's trying to scare us. And it's working," Lucy snapped. "Mom, we should pull out. This isn't worth the risk." Harriet took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "No, Lucy, this is worth it. For once in my life, I'm not going to let him win." That evening, the Maxwell estate was quieter than usual. Harriet and Lucy shared a rare moment of peace in the living rooms, the tension between them softening. "Do you remember the last time we sat like this?" Harriet asked, her voice tinged with nostalgia. Lucy smiled faintly. Before everything fell apart, you were painting in the kitchen, and I was doing homework. Harriet reached out, taking her daughter's hand. I want us to have moments like that again. No more running, no more fear. Lucy's eyes filled with tears. I just want you to be safe. Ethan entered the room, interrupting the emotional exchange. The truck is ready for tomorrow, he said. Everything's secured. Harriet stood, her expression resolute. Then we're ready. The morning of the exhibition dawned crisp and clear. Ethan drove the truck to the venue, with Harriet and Lucy following in his car. The gallery was a hive of activity, with artists and organizers bustling about, preparing for the event. As Harriet's paintings were unloaded and arranged, she stood back, taking in the scene. It was the first time in decades that her work would be seen by the public. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You've got this, he said. Your work speaks for itself. Lucy remained silent, her gaze darting around the room, as if expecting Caldwell to appear at any moment. As the gallery filled with guests, Harriet found herself growing more anxious. She stayed close to her corner of the room, avoiding the mingling crowds. Lucy wandered off, her nerves fraying. She turned a corner and froze when she saw a man standing near the refreshments table. He was older, with sharp features and a cold smile. It was Caldwell. Heart pounding, Lucy rushed back to Harriet. He's here, she whispered urgently. Harriet's stomach dropped. Where? Near the back, Lucy said. We need to leave. Before Harriet could respond, Ethan joined them, his expression darkening as he listened. No one's leaving, he said. Not until we make this right. Caldwell approached Harriet's corner of the gallery, with deliberate steps, his presence commanding attention. Guests turned to watch as the tension in the room became palpable. Harriet, he said smoothly, his smile venomous. It's been far too long. Harriet squared her shoulders, refusing to back down. Not long enough. I must say I'm impressed, Caldwell continued, his tone dripping with mock admiration. You've managed to claw your way back into relevance. How quaint. Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady. That's enough. You have no business here. Caldwell's gaze shifted to Ethan, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Ah, the benefactor. Tell me, Mr. Maxwell, do you know who you're dealing with? I know exactly who you are, Ethan replied coldly, and so does everyone else. At that moment, the gallery doors opened, and a journalist entered, camera in hand. It was Amelia Gray, the art critic who had once exposed Caldwell's unethical practices. She approached with purpose, holding a folder of documents. Richard Caldwell, Amelia said, her voice echoing in the gallery. Care to explain these? Caldwell's confident facade faltered as the crowd murmured. The documents detailed years of fraud and intimidation, painting him as the predator he truly was. As the gallery buzzed with activity, Caldwell turned to Harriet, his composure crumbling. You think this changes anything? He hissed. You'll never escape me. Harriet met his gaze, her voice steady. I already have. Before Caldwell could respond, security arrived, escorting him out of the gallery. The room erupted into applause, but Harriet's relief was tempered by a lingering unease. Ethan leaned close, his voice low. It's not over yet. We've just started the fight. As Harriet looked around the room, she realized he was right. This was only the beginning of her battle for freedom and redemption. The gallery was quiet now, the echoes of applause and murmurs fading as the last of the guests trickled out into the cool Seattle night. Harriet Brown sat in the corner of the exhibition hall, Her shoulders slumped as exhaustion overtook her. The confrontation with Caldwell had drained her more than she realized. Ethan Maxwell walked in with 2 cups of tea, setting one in front of Harriet. "You did it," he said softly, sitting beside her. "The world saw your art tonight, and they loved it." Harriet gave a faint smile, but didn't meet his gaze. "It's not over," she murmured, her voice heavy with resignation. Lucy entered the room, her steps hesitant. She approached her mother and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mom," she said quietly, "it's time we talked. About everything." The trio retreated to the estate later that evening, the weight of the night pressing heavily on them. Seated in the living room, with the soft glow of the fireplace flickering against the walls, Harriet took a deep breath. "It's time you both know everything," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan and Lucy exchanged glances, their curiosity and concern mirrored in their expressions. Harriet looked at Lucy, her gaze filled with regret. "I owe you the truth about your father." Lucy froze, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" Harriet leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant as she began her story. "I was a young artist, just starting to make a name for myself in New York. That's when I met Richard Caldwell. He was charming, sophisticated, and knew exactly how to flatter me. At first, I thought he saw me as an artist with potential, but it became clear he had other intentions." Ethan's jaw tightened as Harriet continued. "He convinced me to trust him, to let him manage my career. But his promises turned to control. He dictated which pieces I could paint, where I could show them, and even who I could associate with. I was young and naive. I thought it was love." Lucy clenched her fists, her heart aching for her mother. "And my father." Harriet's voice broke. "Richard wasn't just controlling. He was ruthless. When I became pregnant with you, I thought it might soften him. But he saw you as a liability. He told me to give you up, to pretend you didn't exist." Ethan leaned forward, his expression incredulous. "He said that?" Harriet nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I refused. That's when he threatened me. He said if I didn't comply, he'd ruin me. And he did. He sabotaged my exhibitions, blacklisted me from galleries, and spread lies about my work being plagiarized." Lucy's voice trembled. "But if Caldwell isn't my father, then who is?" Harriet hesitated, her tears intensifying. "Your father was a kind man, a gallery curator named Michael Carrington. He believed in my talent, and he believed in us. But when Caldwell found out about him, he made sure Michael lost everything. His career, his reputation, even his life." Ethan's breath caught. "He killed him?" Harriet shook her head. "Not directly, but he pushed Michael to the brink. The pressure, the humiliation. It was too much. He took his own life." Lucy's hands covered her mouth, her tears falling freely. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I thought I was protecting you," Harriet whispered. "I wanted to shield you from the darkness, but I see now that I was wrong." The room was heavy with silence, the weight of Harriet's revelations settling over them. Ethan finally spoke, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Caldwell has controlled your life for too long. This ends now." Lucy looked at Ethan, her eyes narrowing. "And how do you suggest we do that?" "We expose him fully," Ethan replied. "Tonight was just the beginning. With Amelia Gray's help, we can bring his crimes into the light. But we'll need to be smart about it." Harriet nodded, her resolve strengthening. "I'm tired of running. I'll do whatever it takes to stop him." The following day, Ethan arranged a meeting with Amelia Gray. The art critic arrived at the estate with a folder of evidence, her expression both grim and determined. Caldwell has a long history of silencing his victims. Amelia began, spreading the documents across the table. Fraud, coercion, intimidation. It's all here, but it's not enough to convict him. We'll need more. Harriet studied the papers, her heart sinking. What more can we do? Amelia glanced at Ethan. We dig deeper. If we can find witnesses willing to testify, people Caldwell has wronged, it will strengthen the case. Lucy spoke up, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Then, let's start digging. The group devised a plan to gather more evidence against Caldwell. Harriet would use her growing public platforms to draw attention to his crimes, while Amelia worked to locate other victims. Ethan, meanwhile, focused on tightening security at the estate, anticipating Caldwell's retaliation. As they worked, Harriet began painting again, pouring her emotions into her art. Each stroke of her brush felt like a step toward reclaiming her identity. She started a new piece, a haunting portrait of a woman, standing in the shadows, her face partially obscured, but her eyes burning with defiance. One evening, as Harriet worked late in her studio, the estate's security alarm blared. Ethan rushed to the control panel, his heart racing. The cameras revealed a figure near the front gate, a man dressed in black, holding a small package. By the time Ethan and Lucy reached the gate, the man was gone, leaving the package behind. Inside was a single painting, a crude imitation of Harriet's style, with the words, "Stay silent or suffer the consequences," scrawled across it. Harriet's hands trembled as she held the painting. He's trying to intimidate me. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. We won't let him. As the group regrouped in the living room, the weight of their fight against Caldwell loomed large. Harriet looked at Lucy and Ethan, her voice steady despite her fear. We've come this far, she said. I'm not backing down now. Lucy nodded, her expression fierce. Neither am I. Ethan glanced at the security monitor, his jaw set. Then we fight. Together. But as the night wore on, a chilling realization settled over them. Caldwell wasn't just playing games. He was preparing for war. The morning sun rose over Seattle, casting a golden glow over the Maxwell estate. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, yet filled with a quiet determination. Today was a day of reckoning for Harriet Brown and her family, a day that would either push them forward or set them back immeasurably. Ethan Maxwell stood at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone. The notification he had been anxiously awaiting appeared at last. He smiled and called out, "Harriet, Lucy, come here." Harriet and Lucy entered the room, their faces filled with apprehension. What is it? Harriet asked. Ethan turned the phone to show them the email. You're officially one of the 3 finalists. They've invited you to present your work at the Seattle Art Exhibition next week. Harriet's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. Lucy's expression was a mix of pride and concern. Mom, that's amazing, she said, her voice soft. But I know, Harriet replied, her voice trembling. Caldwell. The announcement of Harriet's finalist status quickly spread through local art circles and even reached major news outlets. Reporters began calling for interviews, eager to learn more about the mysterious artist making her return after decades in obscurity. Ethan took charge of managing the media. We'll only agree to interviews with trusted outlets, he explained during a family meeting. This will help control the narrative and keep Caldwell from spreading any lies. Lucy, however, was not convinced. Do you really think he'll just sit back and let this happen? She asked, her tone sharp. No, Ethan admitted. But we have to stay ahead of him. The more public support Harriet gets, the harder it will be for Caldwell to retaliate without exposing himself. Across town, In a sleek office overlooking the city, Richard Caldwell stared at the newspaper in his hands. A photo of Harriet accompanied the headline, "Forgotten Artist Makes Triumphant Return." Caldwell's grip on the paper tightened. "So, you've decided to play this game, Harriet," he muttered under his breath. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "I need you to deliver a message," he said to the person on the other end. "Make sure she knows there are consequences for stepping out of line." The Maxwell estate was bustling with activity as preparations for the exhibition ramped up. Harriet worked tirelessly in her studio, finishing a piece she had started years ago, but abandoned when her life fell apart. It was a striking depiction of a woman breaking free from chains, her face a mixture of pain and triumph. Late one evening, Lucy found a sealed envelope on the front porch. The words, "For Harriet," were scrawled across the front in bold, jagged handwriting. Inside was a photograph of Harriet and Lucy from years ago, taken without their knowledge. Scrawled across the back were the words, "Stay silent or she pays the price." Lucy rushed to find Ethan and Harriet, her hands shaking as she handed them the note. Harriet's face turned pale as she read it. "He's escalating," she whispered. "He's not just coming after me. He's coming after us." Ethan immediately contacted Amelia Gray, the journalist helping them gather evidence against Caldwell. "We need to accelerate our timeline," he told her over the phone. "He's threatening Harriet's family now." Despite the looming threats, Harriet refused to back down. "I've run from him for too long," she said to Lucy and Ethan. "I won't let him take this opportunity from me." The days leading up to the exhibition were a whirlwind of activity. Ethan hired additional security to monitor the estate and the gallery. Amelia worked to secure more evidence against Caldwell, reaching out to other victims who might be willing to come forward. Meanwhile, Harriet poured all her energy into her art. She completed 3 new pieces, each one reflecting her journey of resilience and defiance. One depicted a phoenix rising from the ashes, a clear metaphor for her own life. The night before the exhibition, Harriet gathered Lucy and Ethan in the living room. She held up a small framed photograph of a man with kind eyes and a warm smile. "This is Michael Carrington," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Lucy, this is your father." Lucy took the photo, her eyes filling with tears. "He looks so kind," she whispered. "What was he like?" Harriet smiled wistfully. "He was everything Caldwell wasn't. Compassionate, supportive, and brave. He believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on Harriet's shoulder. "We'll make sure his memory is honored," he said. As the family prepared for bed, Ethan received a call from Amelia. "I found another victim," she said. "Her name is Diana Green, and she's willing to testify. But there's a problem. She's scared. Caldwell ruined her life, and she's afraid he'll do it again." Ethan sighed. "We'll talk to her tomorrow. For now, let's focus on getting through the exhibition." The morning of the exhibition dawned with a sense of both anticipation and dread. As Harriet stood before her completed works, she felt a mixture of pride and fear. Lucy entered the studio, holding an envelope. "It came this morning," she said, handing it to Harriet. Harriet opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sentence written in bold letters, "I'll see you tonight." Harriet's breath caught, but she straightened her shoulders. "Let him come," she said. "This time I'm ready." Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression resolute. "We all are." The Seattle Art Exhibition buzzed with anticipation as artists, collectors, and critics mingled under the high ceilings of the prestigious gallery. Harriet Brown stood near her displayed paintings, her heart pounding as the crowd admired her work. Yet, in the midst of the admiration, an air of tension lingered. Richard Caldwell was here. Ethan Maxwell adjusted his tie and scanned the crowd, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of trouble. Security personnel stationed discreetly around the gallery were part of his meticulous preparations. Despite their presence, a sense of unease gnawed at him. Harriet's paintings drew attention almost immediately. Her phoenix rising from the ashes captivated viewers, with critics murmuring about the depth of emotion and resilience the piece evoked. Several approached Harriet to offer compliments, but she remained reserved, her mind elsewhere. Lucy stood by her mother, offering quiet support. "You've got this," she whispered. Harriet nodded, forcing a smile. The room seemed to shift as Richard Caldwell entered, exuding his usual air of confidence. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries as though he belonged. His eyes locked on Harriet, and a slow, calculated smile spread across his face. Ethan spotted him immediately. "He's here," he said to Lucy, who stiffened. Harriet turned, her face pale but determined. "Let him look," she said quietly. "I won't hide anymore." Caldwell approached, his voice smooth as silk. "Harriet," he said, inclining his head. "It's been far too long." Harriet stood her ground, her chin lifted. "Not long enough." As the exhibition progressed, Caldwell's attempts to intimidate Harriet became more overt. He lingered near her paintings, making pointed comments to other attendees about the validity of her work. His words were laced with venom, but Harriet refused to let him see her falter. Lucy, however, couldn't hold back. "Why are you even here?" she demanded, stepping between Caldwell and her mother. Caldwell smirked. "Just appreciating the art," he said innocently. "Although I must admit, it's curious how quickly someone can rise from obscurity." Ethan joined them, his tone sharp. "And yet, here you are, desperately trying to cling to relevance." The tension was palpable, drawing the attention of nearby guests. Caldwell's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. "Enjoy your moment, Harriet," he said, his voice low. "It won't last." Amelia Gray arrived halfway through the evening, carrying a folder filled with damning evidence against Caldwell. She pulled Ethan aside and opened the folder to reveal financial records, fraudulent contracts, and testimonials from other artists he had exploited. "This is enough to implicate him," she said, "but we need to time it perfectly. If we go public now, we risk losing the momentum Harriet has gained tonight." Ethan nodded. "We wait for the right moment." As Caldwell continued to linger in the gallery, Lucy made a bold decision. She slipped out unnoticed and headed to the hotel where Caldwell was staying. She knew it was risky, but she needed answers about her father, about the threats, and about why Caldwell seemed so intent on destroying her mother. At the hotel, she confronted him in the lobby. "I want the truth," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Why do you hate my mother so much?" Caldwell's smile was icy. "Your mother," he said, leaning closer, "made the mistake of thinking she could outsmart me. And you're just like her, arrogant and naive." Lucy didn't back down. "You can threaten us all you want, but you're not invincible." Caldwell's expression darkened. "Careful, little girl," he said, his voice low. "You don't know what you're getting into." Back at the gallery, Ethan noticed Lucy's absence and grew concerned. He quietly slipped out to search for her, leaving Harriet with Amelia. When he found Lucy returning from the hotel, her face flushed with anger, he pulled her aside. "What were you thinking?" he demanded. "I needed to face him," Lucy said. "He's not just a threat to Mom. He's a threat to all of us." Ethan's expression softened. "Next time, let me help." We're in this together. The highlight of the evening came when Harriet was invited to speak about her work. Standing in front of the crowd, she took a deep breath and began. "These paintings represent more than just art to me," she said. "They represent survival, resilience, and the power of truth." As she spoke, Caldwell moved closer, his presence looming, but Harriet didn't falter. "For too long, I allowed fear to silence me. Tonight, I choose to reclaim my voice." The crowd erupted in applause, but the moment was interrupted when Caldwell stepped forward. "Reclaim your voice?" he sneered. "Or fabricate a story for sympathy?" Gasps rippled through the room. But before Harriet could respond, Ethan stepped in. "The only fabrication here," he said, "is the facade you've built to hide your crimes." Amelia seized the moment. She handed the folder of evidence to a prominent journalist in the crowd, who quickly began reviewing its contents. "Ladies and gentlemen," Amelia announced, "the truth about Richard Caldwell is here. He's not a patron of the arts. He's a predator." As the journalist read aloud some of the evidence, the crowd turned on Caldwell. His attempts to deflect were futile, as the weight of his actions came crashing down. Amid the chaos, Caldwell made a hasty exit, his carefully constructed reputation in tatters. Harriet stood tall, her paintings a testament to her strength. But as the night drew to a close, Ethan received a text message from an unknown number. "You've made a mistake. This isn't over." He showed the message to Harriet and Lucy. "We've won this battle," he said, "but the war isn't over yet." Harriet nodded, her expression steely. "Let him come. We're ready." The night of the Seattle Art Exhibition had reached its climax. The Grand Gallery, illuminated by brilliant chandeliers, buzzed with an electrifying tension. Harriet Brown, Lucy, and Ethan Maxwell stood together as they faced the greatest challenge of their lives, a public confrontation with Richard Caldwell, a man whose calculated malice had shaped their darkest years. Harriet adjusted the hem of her elegant deep blue dress, her hands trembling slightly. The evening had been a whirlwind of emotions. Her paintings had garnered widespread acclaim, with critics praising the raw emotion and resilience captured in her work. Yet, beneath the surface, Harriet felt the weight of what was to come. Lucy held her mother's hand tightly. "You've got this, Mom," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever happens tonight, we're standing with you." Ethan approached, his phone in hand. "Security is in place," he said quietly. "Amelia has everything ready. The moment we give the signal, Caldwell's house of cards will start to crumble." Harriet nodded, her eyes fierce with determination. "It's time." The gallery doors swung open, and Richard Caldwell entered with the air of a man who owned the room. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, he moved with the confidence of someone who had evaded consequences for far too long. His eyes locked on Harriet, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caldwell announced loudly, drawing the attention of the crowd, "let us all applaud the remarkable Harriet Brown, a woman who has truly mastered the art of reinvention." Gasps rippled through the gallery as his sarcastic tone cut through the celebratory atmosphere. Harriet stepped forward, her head held high. "Reinvention, Caldwell?" she said, her voice unwavering. "Number this is reclamation." The two faced each other in the center of the room, surrounded by an audience that was now captivated by the unfolding drama. Caldwell smirked. "Reclamation? Is that what you call it? Or is it a desperate attempt to rewrite the past?" Ethan stepped in, his voice sharp. "The only thing being rewritten tonight is the truth you've buried for decades." Caldwell's composure faltered momentarily, but he quickly recovered. "And who are you to speak on matters you don't understand?" he sneered. I'm someone who refuses to let you intimidate her, or anyone else, any longer, Ethan shot back. Amelia Gray, who had been quietly observing from the side, chose this moment to act. She stepped forward, holding a stack of documents. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice loud and clear, "I think it's time we shed some light on your history." The crowd turned to her as she handed the documents to a prominent journalist in attendance. These files contain evidence of Richard Caldwell's years of exploitation, fraud, and coercion. Testimonies from artists he's ruined, financial records proving his embezzlement, and even details about the threats he's issued. Caldwell's face turned ashen as the journalist began reading excerpts aloud. The audience murmured in shock, their admiration for Caldwell turning into outrage. With the room now focused on Caldwell's crumbling facade, Harriet stepped forward. She addressed the crowd, her voice steady and powerful. "For years, I let fear silence me. I allowed this man to strip me of my identity, my career, and my family. But tonight, I reclaim what's mine, not just for me, but for every artist he's silenced." The crowd erupted in applause, their support palpable. Caldwell, visibly shaken, tried to speak, but his words were drowned out by the growing chants of the audience. Justice for Harriet. In a last-ditch effort, Caldwell lunged forward, pointing a finger at Harriet. "You're nothing without me," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You were a nobody until I gave you a platform." Ethan stepped in, his tone icy. "And now, she's showing the world who she truly is, without you." Security personnel moved in, surrounding Caldwell. Amelia approached with finality. "You'll be answering for everything, Caldwell," she said. "The authorities are already involved." As Caldwell was escorted out of the gallery, the crowd erupted into cheers. Harriet stood tall, her shoulders straight and her eyes gleaming with triumph. The immediate danger was over, but the emotional toll lingered. Harriet retreated to a quiet corner of the gallery, her breath shallow, as she processed the magnitude of the evening. Lucy joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You did it, Mom," she said softly. "You finally stood up to him." Ethan approached with a glass of water. "You were incredible, Harriet," he said. "But this isn't just your victory. It's a turning point." Harriet smiled faintly. "Thank you for everything." As the gallery began to clear, Amelia approached with a woman in tow, a tall, elegant figure with sharp features and a guarded expression. "Harriet," Amelia said, "this is Diana Green. She has something to tell you." Diana extended a hand, her voice trembling. "I was one of Caldwell's victims too," she said. "But your bravery tonight, it's inspired me to come forward. I want to help." Harriet's eyes filled with tears as she embraced Diana. "Thank you," she whispered. "Together, we can make sure he never hurts anyone else again." As the evening wound down, Ethan received a text message. The sender was unknown, but the message was clear. "You've made powerful enemies tonight. Watch your back." Ethan showed the message to Harriet and Lucy, his jaw tight. "This isn't over," he said, "but we're ready for whatever comes next." Harriet nodded, her resolve unshaken. "We've come too far to back down now." The aftermath of the Seattle art exhibition unfolded like ripples in a pond. Harriet Brown's triumphant stand against Richard Caldwell reverberated across the art world and beyond. Newspapers and online forums buzzed with stories of Caldwell's downfall. But beneath the public celebration lay a quieter, more personal reckoning for Harriet, Lucy, and Ethan. The headlines the next morning were unrelenting. Art dealer Richard Caldwell exposed. Fraud, exploitation, and ruined lives. Harriet Brown's comeback. The artist who stood against the odds. Harriet sat at the kitchen table of Ethan's mansion, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. Lucy scrolled through the articles on her phone, alternating between pride and concern. "Mom, people are calling you a hero," she said, her voice tinged with awe. Harriet shook her head. "I'm no hero, Lucy. I just told the truth." Ethan entered the room with a tablet in hand. "Harriet, this is bigger than you realize. The media frenzy isn't just about Caldwell. It's about your courage to speak up. People are inspired." Harriet glanced at him, her expression weary. "It doesn't feel inspiring. It feels heavy." The victory at the exhibition had brought closure, but it had also reopened old wounds. Harriet found herself revisiting memories she had long buried. Her days as a celebrated artist, the betrayal that shattered her career, and the loss of her husband. One evening, as she worked in her studio, Lucy found her staring at an unfinished painting. "What's wrong?" Lucy asked, sitting beside her. Harriet sighed, her voice heavy with emotion. "For years, I told myself I'd moved on. But standing in that gallery, facing Caldwell, it was like reliving everything all over again." Lucy reached for her hand. "You're not alone anymore, Mom. We're in this together." Harriet smiled faintly. "You've grown into such a strong woman, Lucy. I'm so proud of you." While Harriet and Lucy processed their emotions, Ethan faced his own challenges. The text message he had received after the exhibition lingered in his mind. He had increased security around the mansion, but the threat weighed on him. One afternoon, Amelia Gray visited the mansion with updates. "Caldwell is under investigation, and several of his associates are cooperating with the authorities," she said. "But there's still a network out there, a system he's been part of for decades." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "We can't let our guard down. If there's more to uncover, we'll find it." Amelia hesitated. "Ethan, this isn't just about Caldwell anymore. You've made enemies. Be careful." As the weeks passed, Harriet and Lucy grew closer. The shared experience of confronting Caldwell had strengthened their relationship. They spent evenings reminiscing about Lucy's childhood, filling in gaps that had long been left unspoken. One night, Lucy asked a question that had been on her mind. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me about Caldwell before?" Harriet looked at her daughter, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I wanted to protect you. I thought if I kept you in the dark, you'd be safe." Lucy nodded slowly. "But we're stronger together, right? No more secrets." Harriet smiled, pulling Lucy into a hug. "No more secrets." Despite their personal progress, the external threats loomed large. One evening, a package arrived at the mansion, addressed to Harriet. Inside was a canvas with a crude, mocking imitation of her signature style, and a note. "You'll never escape me." Harriet's hands trembled as she held the note. Lucy snatched it from her. "This is Caldwell, isn't it? He's trying to scare us." Ethan took the note, his expression dark. "We'll report this to the authorities. He can't intimidate us." Amid the chaos, Lucy decided to pursue the truth about her father. With Amelia's help, she tracked down old records and interviews, piecing together fragments of his life. The journey was both painful and enlightening. One breakthrough came when Lucy discovered a photograph of her father with Caldwell, taken at an art event decades earlier. "Why was he with Caldwell?" she asked Harriet, her voice tinged with confusion and anger. Harriet looked at the photograph, her expression conflicted. "He trusted Caldwell once, just like I did. But when he realized the truth, it was too late." Lucy clenched her fists. "He deserved better. We deserve answers." Through it all, Harriet found solace in her art. Her studio became a sanctuary, where she could channel her pain into creativity. She began working on a new series, each painting reflecting a stage of her journey, from despair to hope, from silence to voice. Ethan often visited her studio, offering quiet support. One evening, he stood before a particularly striking piece, a phoenix rising from flames. "It's incredible," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Harriet smiled. "It's how I feel. Broken, but rising again." Ethan nodded. "And stronger than ever." Inspired by her experience, Harriet decided to give back to the artistic community. With Ethan's resources and Amelia's connections, she launched a mentorship program for young, underprivileged artists. The program quickly gained traction, drawing attention from philanthropists and media alike. During the program's launch event, Harriet spoke to the attendees. "Art saved me," she said. "It gave me a voice when I felt silenced. I hope this program can do the same for others." As the evening wound down, Ethan received a call from one of his security team members. "Sir, we've detected unusual activity near the mansion. A car parked outside for hours, and the driver seems to be watching the house." Ethan's expression hardened. "Stay on it. Let me know if they make a move." After hanging up, he joined Harriet and Lucy in the living room. "We need to stay vigilant," he said. "This isn't over." Harriet nodded, her resolve unwavering. "Let them come. We're ready." The mansion hummed with the quiet activity of renewal. After weeks of chaos and confrontation, Harriet, Lucy, and Ethan were beginning to rebuild their lives. The shadows of Richard Caldwell and his lingering threats still loomed, but there was a new sense of hope in the air. For the first time in years, Harriet could envision a future unburdened by fear. In the days following the exhibition, Harriet became a symbol of resilience in the art community. Invitations for interviews, gallery showings, and collaborations poured in. Despite her newfound fame, Harriet remained grounded, focusing on her art and the mentorship program she had launched for young artists. One afternoon, Harriet stood in her newly renovated studio, staring at a blank canvas. "It feels surreal," she said to Ethan, who was leaning against the doorframe. "For so long, I thought my art would never see the light of day again." Ethan smiled. "And now, it's lighting the way for others." Harriet dipped her brush into a vibrant shade of blue. "I just hope I'm doing enough to repay the kindness I've been shown." Meanwhile, Lucy was deep into her investigation into her father's past. With Amelia Gray's help, she pieced together a timeline of his life and his connections to Caldwell. Each discovery brought her closer to the truth, but also uncovered painful memories. One evening, Lucy approached Harriet with a file in hand. "Mom," she said softly, "I found something." Harriet looked up from her sketchpad, her expression apprehensive. "What is it?" Lucy handed her a photograph. Oh, it was an old black-and-white picture of Lucy's father, Michael Brown, standing with Richard Caldwell at an art gallery. "Why didn't you ever tell me they knew each other?" Lucy asked, her voice wavering. Harriet stared at the photograph, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't know how to explain it," she admitted. Michael trusted Caldwell. He believed in his vision. But when he saw the truth, the exploitation, the greed, it broke him. Lucy sat beside her mother, her hand on hers. "I want to know more about him, Mom. Not just the man Caldwell betrayed, but the man he was to you." Harriet smiled wistfully. "He was kind, brave, and fiercely loyal. He loved you more than anything." Ethan, inspired by Harriet's resilience and Lucy's determination, began channeling his resources into meaningful causes. His latest project was a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of fraud and exploitation in the art world. At a board meeting, Ethan presented his vision, This foundation isn't just about funding, he said. It's about creating a safety net for those who have been silenced, people like Harriet, who deserve to have their voices heard. The board members applauded, but Ethan's focus remained on the greater goal. Later that evening, he confided in Harriet. "I've spent so much of my life chasing success," he said, "but now I see that true success is about making a difference." Harriet placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're already doing that, Ethan, and it's inspiring." Despite the progress, there were still tensions to navigate. Mrs. Goodwin, Ethan's loyal housekeeper, remained skeptical of Harriet and Lucy's presence. One morning, she approached Ethan in the kitchen. "Mr. Maxwell," she began hesitantly, "do you really think it's wise to trust them so completely?" Ethan frowned. "Mrs. Goodwin, they've been through enough. They've earned our trust." Mrs. Goodwin sighed. "I just don't want to see you get hurt." Later, Harriet found Mrs. Goodwin pruning roses in the garden. "I know you're worried," Harriet said gently, "and I don't blame you. But I promise I'm not here to take advantage of Ethan's kindness." Mrs. Goodwin looked at Harriet, her expression softening. "I see how hard you're trying, and for what it's worth, I admire your strength." As Harriet's story continued to inspire, the local community rallied around her. At the first workshop for her mentorship program, young artists eagerly gathered to learn from her. Harriet walked among them, offering guidance and encouragement. One teenager, Mia, showed her a half-finished portrait. "Do you think it's any good?" she asked nervously. Harriet knelt beside her. "It's more than good," she said. "It's honest, and that's the most important thing an artist can be." Ethan watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride. "She's incredible," he said to Amelia, who stood beside him. "She is," Amelia agreed. "And so are you, Ethan. None of this would have been possible without your support." Amid the progress, Lucy's search for her father's story took an unexpected turn. Amelia contacted her with a lead. A man named James Hollis, who had once been Michael Brown's best friend, was living in a nearby town. Lucy hesitated, unsure if she was ready for what she might learn. Harriet encouraged her. "Lucy, finding answers is never easy, but it's the only way to heal." Lucy nodded. "I have to know, Mom." One quiet evening, as Harriet painted in her studio, Lucy entered holding a weathered envelope. "This was in Dad's file," she said, handing it to her mother. Harriet opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten letter from Michael, dated shortly before his death. "Oh, Harriet," it read, "if you're reading this, it means I couldn't protect you the way I wanted. But know this, you're stronger than anyone I've ever known. And Lucy, our Lucy, is destined for greatness. Take care of her, and take care of yourself." Tears streamed down Harriet's face as she read the letter aloud. Lucy hugged her tightly. "He believed in you, Mom. In both of us." As the family began to heal, Ethan received another ominous message. "You've exposed Caldwell, but you've made powerful enemies. This isn't over." He showed the message to Harriet and Lucy. "We need to be ready," he said. "There's more at stake than we realized." Harriet nodded, her resolve firm. "We've faced worse. We'll face this too." The crisp air of a late Seattle autumn wrapped the city in shades of amber and gold. The Maxwell Mansion, now a hub of hope and healing, buzzed with quiet activity as Harriet, Lucy, and Ethan prepared for another step in their journey. This time the focus wasn't on art or justice, but on family, an elusive concept that was finally starting to take shape. Lucy's search for her father had reached a crucial juncture. Amelia Gray's lead on James Hollis, Michael Brown's closest friend, had opened a door to answers Lucy had sought her entire life. Yet, as she sat in the living room with Harriet and Ethan, clutching a manila folder filled with James's contact information, doubt clouded her mind. "What if he doesn't want to talk to me?" Lucy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harriet placed a comforting hand on her daughter's. "Lucy, your father's story deserves to be told, and you deserve to know it. Whatever happens, we're here for you." Ethan nodded. "You've come this far, Lucy. Don't let fear stop you now." Taking a deep breath, Lucy made the call. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "This is James Hollis." Lucy hesitated, then said, "Mr. Hollis, my name is Lucy Brown. I think you knew my father, Michael Brown." There was a long pause on the other end. "Michael's daughter?" James's voice softened. "I never thought I'd hear from you." "Yes, I knew your father. I'd be honored to meet you." The following day, Lucy, Harriet, and Ethan drove to a small coastal town, 2 hours from Seattle, where James lived in a modest bungalow overlooking the sea. The drive was filled with a mixture of anticipation and unease. As they approached the house, Lucy gripped Harriet's hand. "What if he tells me something I don't want to hear?" "Then we face it together," Harriet said firmly. James greeted them at the door, his weathered face lighting up with a warm smile. "You look just like your father," he said to Lucy, his voice thick with emotion. "Come in, all of you." Over cups of steaming coffee, James shared stories about Michael. He described a man full of life and passion, someone who believed in art as a force for change. But as the conversation deepened, darker truths emerged. Caldwell wasn't just a manipulative dealer, James said. He was ruthless. When Michael confronted him about his fraudulent practices, Caldwell didn't just threaten him, he destroyed him. James explained how Caldwell orchestrated a smear campaign against Michael, leading to the loss of his career and reputation. Michael fought back as hard as he could, but in the end, he couldn't win against someone as powerful as Caldwell. Tears streamed down Lucy's face. "He was trying to protect us," she said, her voice trembling. "He was," James confirmed. "And he would be so proud of you for standing up to Caldwell now." As the conversation continued, James revealed another startling piece of information. "There's something else you need to know," he said, looking at Harriet. "Michael wasn't just fighting for his own family. He was fighting for yours too." Harriet frowned. "What do you mean?" James hesitated, then said, "Caldwell didn't just exploit artists. He used their work to launder money for powerful figures. Michael discovered that your family's financial troubles weren't accidental. They were orchestrated by Caldwell to keep you under his control." Harriet's hand flew to her mouth. "All these years, I thought it was my fault." James shook his head. "It was never your fault. Michael knew that, and he fought to expose Caldwell until the very end." The revelations left the room heavy with emotion, but also with a sense of closure. As they prepared to leave, James handed Lucy a small box. "This belonged to your father," he said. "I've kept it all these years, hoping I'd get to give it to you someday." Inside the box was a locket with a photograph of Michael and Harriet, along with a note in Michael's handwriting, "For Lucy, so she'll always know she's loved." Lucy clutched the locket to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The drive back to Seattle was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. Harriet stared out the window, her mind racing with memories of Michael and the life they had lost. Lucy fingered the locket around her neck, feeling a newfound connection to her father. Ethan broke the silence. "We need to make sure Caldwell's network is completely dismantled. No one else should suffer like your family did." Harriet nodded. Agreed. But we also need to focus on moving forward. Michael wouldn't want us to live in the past. Back at the mansion, Harriet unveiled a new painting she had been working on. A sprawling landscape of a sunrise over a stormy sea. It's about finding hope after the storm, she explained. Lucy smiled. It's beautiful, Mom. Just like our story. That evening, as the family settled in for the night, Ethan received an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "The fight isn't over." Inside was a single sentence. Caldwell was just the beginning. Ethan's heart sank as he realized the battle was far from over. But as he looked at Harriet and Lucy, he felt a renewed determination. Together, they would face whatever came next. The soft hum of morning filled the air as the sun rose over Seattle, casting a golden glow across the Maxwell mansion. Inside, the house brimmed with life. Harriet, Lucy, and Ethan were preparing to take the next steps in their intertwined journeys, each of them determined to forge a future defined by hope and resilience. Harriet stood in her studio, staring at her latest creation. The canvas was alive with color, depicting a phoenix rising from ashes. Each brushstroke spoke of renewal, a tribute to her journey from a broken artist to a celebrated symbol of perseverance. The piece was destined for a prominent position at the Seattle Art Museum, an honor that cemented her return to the art world. Ethan entered the studio, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "It's stunning," he said, placing a mug on the work table. "It's more than art. It's your story." Harriet smiled softly. "It's our story. None of this would have been possible without you and Lucy." "You gave us just as much, Harriet," Ethan said. "This family wouldn't exist without your strength." Meanwhile, Lucy was on the verge of completing her quest to uncover the truth about her father. With James Hollis's help, she had traced her father's final days and unearthed details about his battle against Caldwell. Yet, one piece of the puzzle remained unresolved. The man who had raised her questions about her biological father. James had revealed a startling truth during their last meeting. Lucy's biological father was alive. With this revelation, Lucy began a new search, reaching out to contacts and sifting through old records. One evening, Lucy received an unexpected call. "Lucy Brown?" a voice asked. "Yes, this is Lucy," she replied, her heart racing. "This is Mark Simmons," the man said. "I believe I'm your father." The following weekend, Lucy met Mark Simmons at a quiet cafe in Seattle. The man before her was tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that mirrored her own. The conversation was hesitant at first, filled with awkward silences and nervous smiles. "I didn't know about you," Mark confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother and we lost touch when Caldwell came into the picture. I tried to find her, but by then, it was too late." Lucy studied his face, searching for any trace of deception, but finding only sincerity. "I've spent so long wondering who I am," she said softly. This changes everything." Mark reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "You're a remarkable young woman, Lucy. I don't want to miss another moment of your life." Ethan's nonprofit foundation, the Maxwell Initiative for Justice and Art, was gaining momentum. Designed to provide legal aid and advocacy for artists who had been exploited, the foundation was Ethan's way of ensuring that no one else would face the hardships Harriet endured. At the foundation's first fundraiser, Harriet and Lucy stood by Ethan's side. The event was a resounding success, attended by art enthusiasts, philanthropists, and journalists eager to support the cause. As the evening wound down, Ethan took the stage. "This isn't just about protecting artists," he said. "It's about creating a world where creativity is celebrated and safeguarded. A world where people like Harriet and Lucy can thrive without fear. The crowd erupted into applause, but Ethan's gaze remained on Harriet and Lucy, his unwavering pillars of support. With Mark Simmons's arrival, the Maxwell household grew livelier. Mark quickly bonded with Lucy, joining her and Harriet for long conversations about the past. Harriet found solace in Mark's presence, recognizing a piece of her lost history in the man she once loved. One afternoon, as the family gathered in the garden, Ethan brought out a surprise. "I've been working on something," he said, handing Harriet and Lucy a set of keys. "What's this?" Harriet asked, her brow furrowing. "It's your new home," Ethan said with a grin. "A cottage on the estate grounds. You've earned a space that's truly yours." Harriet's eyes filled with tears as she embraced Ethan. "You've given us so much more than a home," she said. "You've given us a second chance." As they settled into their new cottage, Harriet worked tirelessly on a piece she called Rebirth. The painting was destined for the grand reopening of the Seattle Art Museum, where it would serve as the centerpiece of a special exhibition dedicated to resilience in the face of adversity. The unveiling was a moment of triumph. The painting, a vivid depiction of a phoenix soaring over a landscape of ashes, brought tears to the eyes of those who saw it. Critics hailed it as Harriet's masterpiece, a testament to the indomitable spirit of the human soul. Just as the family began to find peace, an anonymous letter arrived at the cottage. The note, scrawled in sharp, deliberate handwriting, read, "You've taken down Caldwell, but the shadows run deeper. This isn't over." Harriet handed the letter to Ethan, her hands trembling. "What does this mean?" she asked. "It means we have more work to do," Ethan said grimly. "But this time we're ready." And so Harriet, Lucy, Ethan, and Mark took their first steps into a brighter tomorrow, united by love and resilience. But as they celebrated their victories, a shadow lingered, a reminder that their journey was far from over. What secrets lie in wait? What challenges will they face next? Only time will tell. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you discovered long-buried family secrets? Or if you had the chance to rewrite your future? Drop a comment below and share your perspective. Your voice matters here. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible story. Together, we'll uncover what's next for Harriet, Lucy, and Ethan. Stay tuned for the twists, turns, and heartfelt moments that lie ahead.